Idea of where we're at. Last time we had a flood was almost 2 years ago. I think we're about a week short of the anniversary of that date. In that time, several of us have gotten together, Representative Bennett and his effervescent assistant Angel Crawford have kind of led the way with us in getting together with people from Kankakee County, as well as people from over in Indiana, the Kankakee River Basin Commission. When we first started doing that, which goes back into July, I believe it was, of 2018, we found out that they were already, that's the Kankakee River Basin Commission I'm referring to, they already were putting together plans to have a study and a work plan done that was going to include not only the entire watershed in Indiana, but also in the areas in Kankakee County and Iroquois County. As a result of that, Burke Engineering was hired to do the study, and they're here tonight to present the results of that study with the focus on Iroquois County. Before we get into that, however, I just wanted to take a minute to introduce some guests that we have with us tonight. Over here we have Mayor John Allhands, and down here in front we have Scott Pellath, who's the Executive Director of the Kankakee River Basin Commission. Scott, did you want to say a couple words?
Good evening, everybody. Thanks, Chairman Shore, for inviting me over. I just arrived from Michigan City, Indiana, a nice 2-hour drive in the drifting snow, and I'm amazed at how many people are here this evening, and it certainly speaks very well for the efforts that are occurring here locally. I just wanted to say a couple things about what we have done and are doing over in Indiana, because this is a shared problem between our two great states. Last year, the Indiana General Assembly created what's now known as the Kankakee River Basin and Yellow River Basin Development Commission. And they restructured our governance body, and they also added a regional revenue stream to start to tackle 100 years of mounting water resource challenges in our basin area. And like our friends across the state line, agriculture is extraordinarily important to us. Not just from an economic standpoint, but from a job standpoint and a local government funding standpoint. So we've started to try to address these problems, and already we are beginning to tackle the issue of sand coming from Indiana and entering Illinois and winding up, throughout the entire, Mississippi drainage area. We are going to reconstruct the banks of the Yellow River, which begins in St. Joseph County over in Indiana, and stop the relentless erosion that's been transpiring over decades. The other thing that we're going to do is look for places where we can store water upstream. And we're already in conversations with some agricultural leaders about where there might be lands that are appropriate to hold water before it gets down to us on this end. And then finally, we're looking at removing some man-made barriers which are impeding the natural flow of water. As we speak, the Indiana General Assembly is looking at adopting some language to help us remove the state line bridge, which during the next flood could very well wind up in Illinois. It's in such bad shape. These things would not have been possible if leaders and citizens weren't willing to work together to really commit to making long-term changes. They're not going to be fixed in a day because they weren't created in a day. But everybody agreed that given some of the recent flood calamities we've had, we have to start somewhere. And finally, the dime has turned, and it's been a great thing, and I want to thank you again, Chairman Schur, to be able to have this coordination across state lines. I don't want to say that it's unprecedented, but it's certainly not common. And it's been an extraordinarily gratifying thing to be part of. And if at any time I can do anything, whether it be inspirational or question answering or any needs you might have here over in Illinois, please let me know. I'd be happy to share our experiences. And if there's any information I can give that might be helpful as you do similar things over here, I will always be available in order to do that. And thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks always for the kind invitation over here.
Before we get on with the Burke Engineering Over here on my right is Chairman Andy Wheeler from Kankakee County. And with that, we'll turn the microphone over to Cy Beck from Christopher Burke Engineering, and they'll begin their presentations.
Thank you, Chairman Schur. It's an honor for us to be here and try to give you a summary of this study that we have done for Kankakee River Basin Commission and the, as was stated, the two Illinois counties. We have a presentation for you which touches upon some background and into the Kankakee River Basin, particularly in the Iroquois area. Kind of looking for causes of what we are seeing right now. What are the root causes of the problems we are seeing? Kind of explaining what's happening here in terms of a system as a whole. And then we're going to go on and talk a little bit about the trends we are seeing in terms of climate, rainfall, and flow data, and finally get to the recommendations. So I have with me here Bob Barr of the Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis, IUPUI Center for Earth and Environmental Sciences. We are partnered together and as a work, and so Bob and I are going to be tag teaming for this presentation. Bob's going to start and put all the important things, and I would follow on with some minor things. How's that?
As the chairman suggested, we didn't know quite how many people would be here as we came across the driving snow. So, as C of Ash mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about what we found in the work plan and what we were looking at as we came across. Tell you a little bit about the study that we were actually commissioned with and what we were trying to do as we looked into this. And on the Indiana side, we were given this task list. Kind of understand what the root causes of erosion are. Think about the extent of the existing risks. Identify strategies for addressing those risks. And then, unique to this plan, develop a work plan. So this wasn't meant to be another study. This was meant to be a plan that said, these are the problems we see, these are the risks we see, and these are the things that we can do. Very unique. And the sidebar is important. As Scott mentioned, this is an Indiana-Illinois effort. Once again, this is 100 years in the making. The discussions over this have been back and forth for years and never particularly pleasant. We're looking at the whole system when we consider this. And so Iroquois, starting over here in Jasper County in Indiana, coming across through Newton, over into Iroquois, and then flowing north up into Kankakee, makes up half of the Kankakee River Basin as it comes together at Aroma Park. Interestingly enough, though, very little work has been done on the Iroquois when compared to the Kankakee main stem. We had a lot of information on that, a lot of background studies, a lot of data. As we started looking into the Iroquois, we were amazed at how little it had actually been thought about. And there's, I think, some interesting reasons for that. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we come in. This is main stem Kankakee coming across like this. And here is the equally long Iroquois system. So what we heard when we came over into Illinois, and this just starts, remember that C of Ash and I were brought in by the Kankakee River Basin Commission in Indiana. And as our conversations continued, delegates from Illinois, Chairman Wheeler, Chairman Schur, started coming over, and it became clear that we had an opportunity finally to extend this into Illinois and, I would say, do it correctly. It made no sense just working in Indiana if a lot of what we were going to see was over on the Illinois side. And this is what we heard from the folks in Illinois. Sand load is increasing. It just continues to increase. And this is particularly in the Momence area, right across the state line from main stem Kankakee. More sandbars are developing, particularly through Momence, but all the way up into Aroma Park. Conversations, and people would comment, more and more bars. Channel in the Momence area is shifting. And then flooding is increasing in Momence, Aroma Park, and Watseka. And it's literally this one that makes us step back a little bit, because this is the first time, really, that Watseka has been brought into this, in the Iroquois River. Up till then, mainly we're thinking main stem Kankakee. But now with Watsika, Iroquois comes in. And with the Iroquois, a whole different set of issues, a whole different landscape becomes a factor. Dredging and tree removal in Indiana have been concerns on both parts, on the Iroquois and on the main stem Kankakee, because of concerns for increasing flows and sediment. So we find ourselves in the position of wanting to understand more about the Iroquois River, and as I said, not finding out a whole lot about it. So we start like we generally do all the way up in the headwaters where this river begins. We start in Jasper County, and as we're upstream from Rensselaer, we find the Iroquois River channelized, coming out of what was an old glacial lake bed. So a big, flat, wet area that's been tiled and ditched to get the water out of there, and that's forming the headwaters of what's going to become the Iroquois. And I'm going to repeatedly say Kankakee, because I almost always say Kankakee, so I'm going to have to shift Iroquois in here and be patient with me, please. But as we come down, what we notice is that all of this is made to move the water down. Rensselaer has a long history of being flooded by the Iroquois River. This is what it looks like in the area. You can see it's a fairly small river upstream from Rensselaer, and it comes easily out of its banks. It's very flat, floods out across the whole area. So as we come into Rensselaer and we move downstream to Brook, the river gets bigger, and if you'll notice, we have a straightened river inside the meanders. Think about this as a miniature Kankakee in Indiana. Literally, they tried to do the same thing on another river. They came down to the other trib, and they tried to do it on the Iroquois, but they weren't as successful. But on this reach, they came through from Rensselaer, as I said, down to Brook. You can see how they've cut through some. And so what they've done is they've made the river straighter, so they've sped it up. The meanders slow it down, so they've speeded it up, so it's ditched above, coming down quickly. Now they've made it move more quickly through this area. They've detached most of the meanders. And that's going to continue up to Brook. But then when you get below Brook, you start to see a natural river again. So just like the Kankakee up north, now we have a ditched, straightened river system hitting a more natural river system. So there's a period of adjustment that's going to take place. This is the Iroquois River downstream from Rensselaer. You can see how straightened it is. You can see some of the old oxbows on this side. And very small levees through here. And that's one of the big differences, I think, because they didn't have the sand that they had up in northern Indiana, in the Kankakee main stem. The clay down in this area was more difficult for them to work. The levees are much lower and much easier to overtop. So we have a very different river system and a very different response. As we go from Brook all the way over to Watsika, this main long stretch, we have a forested corridor with a fairly natural river. And this river is absorbing the energy of everything up above as it comes down through them. And this is what it looks like as you come in from Brook all the way to Watsika. Notice the size. Notice how we went from a fairly small river above Rensselaer to a slightly larger river there between Rensselaer and Brook. Now down from Brook over to Watsika, this becomes a fairly good-sized river, and it does it quickly. A lot of energy, a lot of power. Forested on both sides, fairly large and expansive riparian corridor. From Watsika to Aroma Park, after we have the confluence with Sugar, it really becomes a much different river. Turns and goes to the north. It looks like this. So you have several different, if you will, river types involved here. We have the straightened system over in Jasper County. We have a modified reach between Rensselaer and Brook. Then we've got the Brook to Watsika reach, which is a very natural river, a little bit bigger, and then now a big river that's going to go from Watsika north, up and join the Kankakee. So different rivers, different problems, different areas with different concerns. We were surprised initially at the variability in the river system. We were surprised at how long the river was. We didn't realize it meandered quite as much as it did. So it actually took me longer to go up and down the Iroquois than it did the main stem Kankakee. As you went around the different meanders, some of the ones, particularly in the area near Brook, I was turning back on myself before I was around the bend, it seemed like, in some places. So very tight. What really surprised us, though, were when we started looking at some of the data that were available in terms of discharge and sediment. Remember, we were doing this as part of a larger study looking at the main stem Kankakee. So that was our reference, if you would. We were looking at that, and we were thinking, okay, so this is how much water we see, this is how much sediment that we see. We started looking at the Iroquois and the Kankakee and comparing them. So let's look at moments and Chavants. Basically, the drainage area is the same, 2294 in moments, 2091 over Chavants. Come down, look at the discharge. 13,000 CFS at moments, 32,000 in Chavants. 3 times more water in the Iroquois than in the main stem Kankakee. 3 times. More water in a river means frequently more sediment. Remember that the main stem Kankakee has been pointed out for decades as pushing a lot of sediment over into Illinois. People complain about it, the folks in Moments yell about it, all the sand, all the problems. Here's the same sediment, same data looking at sediment. Chavants, almost 400,000 cubic tons compared to 204,000 in Moments. Twice as much. Iroquois has more water and more sediment than main stem Kankakee ever thought about. Much more powerful river than what we had been looking at. So this actually starts making us think about some of the problems we've heard about in Illinois a little bit differently. This is one that has been documented since the early 80s. Some people from the Illinois Geological Survey started this work. This is a continuation of it. These are in-channel islands near Aroma Park. And these islands have historically been attributed to the clearing and dredging of the Kankakee in Indiana, is when these islands started appearing in the main stem. And it was documented, again, by Illinois Geological Survey that these islands kept growing until about the 1950s. And in the 1950s, they started stabilizing, about 1959, and they didn't really seem to get any bigger after that. And so that led to a very controversial pronouncement in the 1980s by the Illinois Geological Survey that things had stabilized. That the sediment load, the water load, everything out of Indiana had pretty much stabilized. People in Moments quickly said, I don't think so. I think we're still seeing an awful lot of sand coming over here. And that's been debated back and forth since then. But here, you see 1954 in red. And here now you see 1973. And underneath it is a modern air photo. So what you see is them changing. So in 1973, we're here. 1954 was a little bit bigger. And then the modern island is shifted around like this. This island is completely gone. And this island has lost the end here. So the islands now in Aroma Park seem to be not gaining in size and not adjusting that much, is now they seem to be disappearing. So what we start thinking about is, and Siavash is going to speak to this a little more in just a minute, we know that discharge, peak discharge, is increasing. More rain, more frequently, more water. And so it seems like we may be in a position on main stem Kankakee near Aroma, where we now have so much water coming through that we actually have sediment being eroded from the area now instead of being piled there, which would be an interesting development. It would mean that we were past a tipping point in this river, that now the amount of water exceeds the sediment capability of it, and so now we're going to start eroding, which is clearly not what we heard. We had heard that Momence was still being buried in sand, and there was more sand than they could deal with in Aroma Park. It may be that it's being redistributed. So it may mean that some of the things are shifting and moving. But this is a clear indication that things are continuing to change. We also found, up and down the Iroquois, lots of rill development. Now, this is interesting, and we have to think about this a little bit. One of the things to remember is that the sediment in the Iroquois is different from the sediment in the Kankakee. And that's important because we can kind of separate them. When I say it has twice as much sediment, that's overall tonnage. But the sediment coming out of the Iroquois is clay and silt, not the sand that you see in the main stem Kankakee. And this is significant for a couple of reasons. Sand is really visible. Sand piles up on your dock. Sand gets in the middle of the river. Silt and clay just keeps going through. It's heading on downstream. It's going to get into the Illinois River, and it's going to go on down through. You have more of it, and it'll pile up in some places, but it's not the visible problem and nuisance that sand can frequently be. So we wanted to know where all the sediment was coming from, because as we go up and down the Iroquois, I'll be the first to tell you, it's in pretty good shape. I mean, I found some eroded places, but by and large, it was in pretty good shape. Now, mind you, I don't often get invited to look at rivers that are in good shape. So I'm a little bit biased. I see things that are pretty torn up. And the Iroquois is not necessarily like that. But what I did find a lot of were these. And these are rills. These are head cuts that are going up from the river up into the agricultural fields up above. And this develops when you've got a fairly deep valley. So we see these primarily from Newton County in Indiana over towards Watseka, because there you've got a deeper valley and you've got a flat plain on either side, your fields. And then these tend to cut up into it, and these will actually go up into your fields in some places. So these then provide a conduit of sediment dropping down, and you can see here, the Iroquois River is down in the valley below this. So this flat space is what's putting the sediment down in. And this is, in my world, something that's fairly good to see, because this is a problem we can fix fairly easily. This isn't like 10 miles of vertical banks that we see on main stem Kankakee. These are small head cuts that the NRCS has a lot of experience coming in, putting check dams in and shutting off the sediment supply. So this is something that we can work with. We can stabilize the fields. We can reduce the amount of sediment. We can't do much about the amount of rain that's causing these. And CFS is going to talk about this in just a minute. So we have to deal a little bit more with the problem, the symptom. But we have the rain that's going to continue on. This is another one. This is in Watseka. This is another example of the rill, just to show you a local example. This is the bridge on the northwest side of town. And you can see this cut coming up all the way through and putting sediment down into the river. So we found a lot of water. We found a lot of sediment. We think we found a source of a fair amount of the sediment. And we think we found a solution to deal with that. The water is a more challenging problem because you are getting more water. And CFS is going to tell you a little bit about why you're seeing more water and what you might be able to do about that.
Right. The blue color here is what we call a 1% chance floodplain, known as 100-year floodplain, regulatory floodplain. The pink areas are what is known as 500-year floodplain. We also call 0.2% chance floodplain. and the yellow areas are called floodway. So you can see that in this area, whatever lines are yellow on those things, these are roads that are impacted by those floodplains. So the roads that are, can get flooded when that inundation is in that extent. Anything in red is a structure, or homes, or businesses, or buildings that are getting flooded. And of course, here there's a larger picture in the Watsika area, and you are all familiar with it. That type of flooding that you're exposed to, and also other areas. So already you're seeing that you have a lot of vulnerabilities in terms of exposure to flooding. And if you're in the floodplain, the flooding is expected. That is a difficult, I think it's a very simple, statement, but it's also very difficult to understand sometimes. That is, we are in the floodplain, so the floodplain and the flooding is expected. And nothing we have done so far and looked at it is indicating that these floodplains are shrinking. The opposite side, we are seeing those floodplains increasing in size, and there are studies done. Actually, we were in Nazarene University, I think it was a couple of years ago, Bob, we were there, and there was a study was discussed in that one. That study from Notre Dame showed that today's 500-year floodplain is basically within 30 years they're going to have that as a 100-year floodplain. So definitely there's increases in floodplain elevations and in data. So this is a picture of what's happening in terms of rainfall, precipitation in the United States. You can see that in the Midwest where we are located, what we have been seeing last 50, 60 years is about 42% increase in total annual precipitation in heavy rainfalls. So the 1% of the highest rainfalls we recorded are showing an increase as much as 42% over the last 50, 60 years. And also, if you look at this data as another revealing thing in here, which shows the decadal, every decade, how much variation you have from the normal. So the line in the middle is the zero line, is the average number of times that we see those high rainfalls. And if you look at that, it's the number of times of the extreme values. You see that in 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, we really are below the average. That's generally the time that we have most of the infrastructure in this state developed. That's the time you see a lot of those type of experience we have in terms of where some of the work on the rivers were done, the agricultural development in this area. So now, as you look forward from 60s on, you definitely have a different regime, different type of rainfall data, and you can see the increase in here. And so something is different and changed over time. We see the same thing go back here. We see the same thing, I'm sorry, there you go. We see the same thing in terms of peak discharges. So there are stream gauges along the streams. What we have is basically a gauge that measures the water level and then converts that to flow, how much flow is coming to discharge. And so if you record that, and every year the maximum amount that is going to the river in a given location, we're going to plot that against time. So you can see, say, from 1945 to 2019, so you have about basically 70 years of data. Within the 70 years, there is a significant trend in increased discharges. This is in Iroquois, Illinois, 88% increase in this location. You look at Milford, Illinois, you have about 20% or more increases. So you go down to Shabance, Illinois, which Bob talked about. Again, very, very discerning slope in terms of this line of trend, at 81% increase. Shabance is about near the mouth of Iroquois River. Then you have water which is coming from the Momence area, from the Kankakee. They're joined together, and it goes downstream to go past through Wilmington, Illinois at the end. That's another station that we have. And you can see again here, total discharges, which are increasing tremendously. So if you are seeing more flooding, if you're seeing more discharges, this is not something, you're not dreaming about this. This is actually happening. We are recording it, and definitely we see a very discernible trend, 122% increase over this 17 years period. So what does it mean? If we have that one here, first of all, why are these things happening? And we already talked about rainfall increases, so you see the rainfall increasing is partly responsible for this. Now, who is responsible for rainfall increases? We can discuss this, and is it human caused, is it whatever it caused? Doesn't really matter. What it is that we are seeing that rainfall. And one thing I was going to point out here, you see the discussion about the climate change and what's changing and not. And I always, go on and ask that, even if you're not a scientist, if you're not doing that one, I want to ask you, how many of you think that this trend is going to change direction? Not very many. What we are seeing, probably we're going to continue on. So what we expect next 30 years, 40 years, is almost either the same trend or higher. And that's the discussion among the scientists. Is it going to be higher or is it the same trend? Bottom line is we're going to see increased discharges, and some of the causes of that has to do with the rainfall increase, but the rainfall is not the only thing responsible for it. We also can point out to some of the increases due to urban development in some areas, not necessarily in this part of the world. Yes?
Is it possible to ask a quick question about that last graph?
This one?
Can you explain 1956? What is that?
Yeah, I'm not sure that one actually. I noticed that one here. Either that record is probably wrong or not, but I'm not sure. I've got to look back at it. It could be just an anomaly right there. It could be some error in the numbers. Because I don't know if we have seen that before, and it could be something that was recorded. It was recorded in that station, but maybe it did be corrected. But I looked at it myself as well. Good question. Anyway, in terms of the causes of the issues, you have this uncompensated impacts of urban development. The reason I said uncompensated is that for most part, we are doing a good job for most counties. If you have an urban development, we're trying to have some sort of detention or some sort of measure that will check that increase. If we are not doing it, every county we should be doing it. However, we don't really have much in terms of making sure that increased agricultural drainage. And that by agricultural drainage, I mean a lot of ditches and big, basically pipes that we are adding to get rid of the water. Obviously, we want agriculture to happen, as Bob pointed out and was pointed out by Scott, is that we do want agriculture development in the area. It's our life depends on it. But one thing is important. What we have been doing in terms of getting rid of the water as quick as possible has also been responsible for some of the increases we're seeing. So we need to be a little bit smarter about agricultural development as well, and do the same type of things we're doing for urban areas. That is, if we are trying to increase the ditch capacity or add to agricultural tiling, we need to be compensated for it somehow by some sort of a ponds or some sort of regional ponds to keep that from increasing. So we see these increases. We kind of talked about a little bit about why it is happening, but what is the implications of this type of increase in management of our water resources? One thing is that what we find out is that the controlling the flood that we have been doing for years and years may not be as feasible anymore because we have a moving target, right? What is, if I'm trying to build some structure to keep me from flooding from this level, that level is going to be exceeding. So it's becoming more and more difficult and more costly to have projects or structures that would save me from flooding. Strategies have to be cognizant that continued increase in function in the fluctuations of flow, and that means that the type of projects that we ought to have should be to be able to manage a system versus eliminating the hazards. And also what we find out is that because of those fluctuations, we need to be looking at solutions that are more absorbent of those fluctuations, and typically what we see the nature-based solutions, such as some of those solutions we have already suggested in capturing the sediment sand, in fact, in Indiana, as an example, or need to be somewhat nature-based because they fare better with the changing climate. And also, finally, we need to be minimizing the impacts of urban development, and agricultural development becomes even more important than before. We have to pay attention to it. So these are basically changing how we look at the problems, how we want to solve them. So recommendations from our study, and in fact, those part of recommendations that impacts the Iroquois County directly, where we are finding those things, we are categorizing them into two categories. One, what we call adaptation and mitigation. What we are finding out is that in order to solve our problems anymore, in this type of a water resource and flooding problems, we have to have a two-pronged approach. Adaptation meaning that we are recognizing that flooding is going to occur, and despite all the efforts we are doing to control it somehow, to mitigate it, to make it smaller, to keep it from getting worse, we're going to have flooding that's going on and bigger and bigger. So in order to recognize that, we need to be ready for it. So how do we do? We need to, I will go over some of those strategies, such as having a flood response plan, something that we are ready for it. At the same time, we're not going to throw our hands out, we're going to do some mitigation. And that mitigation has to do with some of the projects we can do to keep things from getting worse, or maybe even helping some of these areas, making some of the flows be getting a bit smaller. But all of that we have to do to be smart, to do those things without having adverse impacts. And what I talked a lot about no adverse impact. I just want to have a definition of what no adverse impact is, and that is defined as is a term that came out by Association of State Flood Plain Managers. Well, it talks about an approach that ensures the action of any property owner, public or private, does not adversely impact the property and rights of others. So a lot of times we talk about property rights now. We have a property right to do whatever I want to do, but we are talking about also property rights of people who get affected by what you do. So this is just as important. Now, of course, the quote to the right is, you're familiar with that source of that, but basically trying to say the obvious. It is don't do something that you will not do, to harm. You don't want to do something to harm neighbors, don't do it. So the 2019 work plan, done for Kankakee Iroquois, actually follows that ideology. That is, whatever solution we're going to come with, it cannot put harm on somebody else. Some of the list of adapting strategies for adaptation strategies for Iroquois River. I'm not going through all the list here, but I'm going to show some examples of it. One of those things, for instance, to have developed flood response plans. Now that we know we're going to see flooding, we may want to know ahead of time. Our emergency managers, or city and town officials, the county officials need to know where the flooding occurs, so that they know ahead of time the roads that get closed, the routes that we need to use to get out of that one. So these are called flood response plans, and also flood resilience plans. Resilience plans talk about what are the vulnerable areas, how do we build correctly. And I'm going to have the example of Watsika in a second. So here's the town of Watsika. There's a lot of color things. By the way, these bubbles here are the planning area of this city. In here, what we're talking about is this, what we call adopting some geographical specific resilience strategies. And for that one, what we have seen this work in some other areas is that to divide really the town into different zones. So what we have here, this darker area here, we call it river corridor impact areas. These are the floodway areas or erosional corridor where there is lots, there's basically impact areas, dangerous areas to build in. And when we do any building here, when we do any work here, it impacts others much more. So we need to be avoiding those areas. Strategy here is to avoid those areas and prohibiting the development of those areas in these zones right here. The other area we have seen in the red is the areas that has already been developed. Most of the city was developed some time ago, and if we had this kind of maps very early on, we probably would not have built in here. But now we have the building there, and the flows are increasing, so we see these red areas are all these areas which is already developed in this area. So what are we doing here? These areas strategy is to protect the people, to maybe relocate some, buy out and relocate some of the areas if you can. And if there are structures that cannot be relocated, then we need to have them flood-proofed or protected. Those large areas of amber colors are really important. These are storage areas. These are floodplain areas that are remaining. They're not built upon yet. So our strategy is to keep them open because if you start taking that storage away, the things are getting worse. So it becomes important to have a strategy to keep these areas open. And when we talk about these strategies, these can be introduced into your comprehensive plans, into ordinances, so that these areas or these zones are protected. But more important than all these areas here is what this places that we need to build. We call it safer areas, because we want to see development. We want to see development in areas. We're not discouraging that, but it has to be in the right place. And so at the same time we say don't build in these areas, we're talking about safer areas that the buildings could be going that way. And finally, the watershed. As Bob pointed out, the water comes to here from upstream from Indiana, from the other areas within the watershed, and so a lot of what's happening in the watershed impacts you. So we need to be working with those communities to make sure that flows are not increasing towards downstream. In fact, they can decrease it. We already talked about some of the things Bob pointed out. We really don't know a whole lot about Iroquois River as much as we know in Kankakee, because we don't have detailed studies. What we used, we did some limited studies ourselves as part of this study, but we need to do much more. And the reason is obvious, because again, we're seeing this higher flows and sediment coming down here. In terms of mitigation strategies, we talked about those rills and gullies. We can address those already through methodologies to reduce the sediment supply that's coming down. We can mitigate the increase in flows caused by talling and surface ditching. What we're suggesting is to create new storage areas every time we are looking at increased discharge from the drainage, agriculture drainage, but also going and putting some ponds in there to keep that flow from increasing. And finally, selective flood proofing. Because we're on the floodplain, we know we flooded. Some of the flood proofing, maybe perimeter berms or something like that, or raising the roads could be the things that we can do to mitigate. As Bob pointed out, treating some of this gully erosion may be it's not very difficult. This is NRCS. Sometimes even put ripraps to capture those. Those off-site storage areas can be built outside the river, and we have done several of those projects in different areas, and there are examples of that do work. So the work plan captures some of these recommendations in some sort of maps, and shows every what areas in this identify real and erosion sites, where the stream banks erosion happening. We also looked at some other alternatives which did not meet our criteria of no adverse impact, or were not feasible to do, cost feasible, and some of those things included constructing levees along the rivers, bypass channel around Watsika, large flood control reservoir upstream of Watsika. These are things we looked at, but we did not find them to be feasible or doable in the short term. We also talked about clearing the river, things that suggested clear trees from the banks, or increase tide range, reduce the farm flooding, constructing, improving rivers, ditches to increase flood conveyance. All of these things are basically, we find that may help some particular small area, but it increases the problem to others as well. So some of the implementation consideration is that, obviously to do these projects, you need to have some sort of funding. And I was talking actually a little bit earlier at the beginning of this meeting that even if what is being suggested may not be adequate for all the projects that need to be done and work that need to be done, it's a good first step. That is, even where you have funding from different federal government, there's always a cost share that needs to be happening. And so at least an idea of establishing a conservancy district, it brings at least some initial funding to start doing some of this needed work. There's a need for continuous education and outreach. We need to go back more and discuss reminding everybody that how important it is to adapt to this condition that we are seeing, and for doing the right type of mitigation. And finally, the continued participation in watershed-wide efforts, which Chairman Shore already attends, the Kankakee River Basin, Yellow River Basin Development Commission, and then also you represent also, I believe you go to Iroquois County, to Iroquois River Conservancy District in Indiana. If you take even notes, we are seeing this type of problems. It's not unique to you guys. We see the flooding and sediment issues, and also erosion along the streams, both in Indiana and Illinois. And a lot of times the causes for these things can be found in the watershed rather than your local area here. In the watershed, what are we doing in the watershed as a whole? Increasing flow due to climate change, increasing flow due to unwise urban development, increasing flow due to farmers, drainage boards' responses to increased flooding. In fact, as the rainfall increases, we are trying to do more tiling and more ditches to go in there, and that also increases the flow. So sometimes it's just a response to the rainfall. And then also the missteps, attempting to fix a problem while we basically causing a problem elsewhere. With the changing climate, we have to have the approach of adaptation and mitigation and try to have no adverse impact. And finally, the sustainable funding is needed to successfully implement some of the work plan recommendations. That's all we have at this point, and more than glad to answer questions. The difficult questions, Bob gonna answer, by the way. So.
Thanks for coming out. I got a few minutes just as you got started, and I looked in the parking lot. It made me think of church Sunday morning. It was pretty good. So thanks for coming out tonight, though. This is a very important topic, and I got to tell you, your elected officials have been working on this, oh gracious, 2.5 years, from conversations from this side of the border to the right side or the east side of the border in Indiana. We're part of a huge watershed, 9 counties in Indiana, 2 counties or 3 counties in Illinois. And there's a lot of change that's been going on, coming together in just the last several months, and we really appreciate what's happening with Indiana. Now John and Andy are part of the committee or the board, basically in Indiana, that looks at the overall view perspective of both Indiana and Illinois. When the water hits in Indiana, where does it go? Where does it go? Here. It comes here. And so it's been a great change with John and Andy on there. This is new. 6 months ago you guys have just been put on there? So you need to be aware of the number of conversations and trips and travel that has been taking place all behind the scenes. And so, gentlemen, thank you for all your efforts on that. And of course, John, with Watsika and working with the DNR, getting that financed some $1 million to get that going. This is all part of a number of things that are happening behind the scenes, but it's all focused on water. And so all the things you're going to hear about tonight are going to come down to basically just a couple things. And it's going to help you decide, what do you want to do? It's up to you. You're the only ones voting on this, right? So we're going to talk about this next part of it, but that's a very critical part. We talked about the study with Christopher Burke. That was also part of this aspect. We talked about John Allhands with Watsika and the $5 million there. And also he's working on a mitigation plan. There's just a number of things that are happening because people are caring about what to do with this. And Don, you mentioned the pictures. Thank you for bringing those forward. We sent those over to the Burke Study Group along with those pictures. So there are, again, a lot of things happening behind that. Again, Andy is also working with the River Conservancy District in Kankakee County, just like we're trying to do here, but they're going to be separate. And I don't mean to take anybody's fire, but there's just a number of things that I would like for you to be aware of, because it's taken a lot of time and a lot of interest and a lot of concern. And then the last part here, of course, with Iroquois County and with the River Conservancy. This whole idea of a River Conservancy District is not a new idea. The original act was are you ready for this? 1925. There's about 15 River Conservancy districts in the state of Illinois, all for the same kinds of reasons, with the water, with the flooding, and the issues. I know people are tired, they want to see action, but it takes people coming together to figure out, we all feel the pain, but what do we do? We all have different ideas, but we got to bring them forward. And that's part of the reason why Burke came along with their study to help us understand what makes sense and what comes along the way. So just a number of things. We talked about the new group in Indiana, the Burke study, what John's doing in Watsika, what Andy Wheeler is doing with Kankakee and the River Conservancy, and also, of course, what John and others are doing on the Iroquois County River Conservancy District. So again, thank you for coming. I just want to kind of paint a big picture for just a moment of the number of things that are happening. There's a lot of things you're going to see tonight, but I just was trying to help paint a picture to where you see there's a number of multiple moving parts. Some have started 2 years ago, some started 6 months ago, but just a number of things. And besides, I also appreciate the efforts from the Watsika group for all the flooding. I'm not going to carry right now with all your efforts and your group to try and help take care of the immediate needs of people as the floods came. So I'm very glad to be with you. I'm looking forward to hearing more. And where are we at, Eric?